The divorce court doors opened at 10:41 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, and Everett Caldwell walked out into the Atlanta air and stood on the steps and did not move. Not because he was devastated, not because he was angry, because he was taking inventory. The way a surgeon takes inventory before a procedure, calm, methodical, starting with what is present and working toward what is not. The house was gone. The savings account he had built dollar by dollar across 11 years of double shifts and missed dinners and the quiet loneliness of being married to someone who had already decided to leave but hadn't said so yet. Gone. The car gone. And the community clinic on Farwell Avenue that he had opened 6 years ago, with a folding table and a secondhand blood pressure cuff, and the stubborn conviction that someone had to serve the people the hospital system had quietly decided weren't worth the trouble. Gone. Folded into the settlement like a coupon, like something with no more value than the paper it was printed on. Serena stood on the landing 2 steps above him with Preston Voss at her elbow. Preston was in a charcoal suit that cost more than Everett's first car. He was holding a leather portfolio and looking at his phone and doing an excellent job of pretending that none of this was personal. Serena was smiling. Not the smile of a woman relieved that something painful was finally over. Not even the smile of someone who had won a long fight. Just winning. Plain and unadorned. The smile of a person who had wanted something and gotten it. Everett looked at her for 1 second. Then he looked away. He had one thing left. The judge had said so clearly in that flat judicial tone that treated the pieces of a human life the way an auctioneer treats furniture. Primary residential custody. Nadia, 11 years old, already too sharp for the world she was growing up in. Already watching adults with that quiet, measuring gaze that told you she was keeping a ledger somewhere. And one day, she would present it. He held that fact in his chest like the last ember in a burned-down house. Then he reached into his coat pocket for his car keys and stopped. Right. No car. He stood there on the courthouse steps in Atlanta in October with his hand in an empty pocket, and the faint absurdity of the moment settled over him like weather. 41 years old, board-certified surgeon, father, standing on a public sidewalk trying to figure out how to get to the apartment he had been renting since March, with nothing but a messenger bag and the clothes on his back. He started walking. He made it approximately 30 feet. That was when the sound hit him. A deep, rhythmic thudding from somewhere above and behind, low and insistent, getting louder fast. Several people on the courthouse steps looked up. A few stepped back. Someone grabbed a child's arm on reflex the way parents do when something unexpected and large moves through their airspace without warning. A helicopter. Black. Significant. The kind of aircraft that did not land on courthouse lawns by accident or coincidence or any reason other than someone had decided it would land there, and the world had rearranged itself to accommodate that decision. The hull was marked in silver lettering. Clean and precise. Meridian Air Medical. It settled onto the grass with the certainty of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. The door opened. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped out. Not Preston's charcoal. Something different entirely. The kind of charcoal that comes from knowing exactly what you were doing and having dressed for it every day for several decades. She was in her mid-50s. She moved across the courthouse lawn with the economy of someone who had not wasted a step in a very long time. She walked directly toward Everett, stopped 2 feet in front of him, and looked at him. Dr. Caldwell. Her voice was even, not warm, not cold, precise. The voice of a woman who had learned long ago that clarity was its own form of respect. My name is Vivian Holt. I need you to save lives, and I need you to start today. Everett looked at the helicopter. Looked at her, said nothing for 3 full seconds. On the steps above them, he was aware, without looking directly, that Serena had stopped smiling. That Preston Voss had looked up from his phone. That Preston's face had gone very carefully neutral, in the way faces go neutral when a person is managing information rather than receiving it. Processing, calculating, running numbers on something he had not expected to need to run numbers on this morning. Everett filed that away. You have the wrong man, he said. I have exactly the right man, Vivian Holt said. I'll explain on the flight. He almost laughed. He almost turned around and walked back to the sidewalk and kept going toward the bus stop 6 blocks east and figured out the rest from there. But Nadia had asked him something that morning over cereal, in the careful voice of an 11-year-old who has learned that certain questions need to be asked quietly so the answer doesn't feel like it has to be loud. She had asked him whether things were going to be okay. He had said yes. He had no idea how to make that true. He picked up his messenger bag. He followed Vivian Holt across the courthouse lawn to the helicopter. He did not look back at the steps, not at Serena, not at Preston Voss, not once. The interior of the helicopter was not what he expected. He had expected corporate chrome and leather and the quiet performance of expensive things. What he found was functional to the point of austerity. Medical equipment mounted in precise configurations along the walls, a communications panel, a jump seat, the smell of antiseptic and recycled air, and something faintly mechanical that reminded him unexpectedly of operating room prep at 6 in the morning. Vivian sat across from him as the aircraft lifted. She did not wait for him to settle. Meridian Air Medical operates 31 transport helicopters, she said. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Rural coverage, underserved regions, places where the nearest trauma center is 45 minutes by road, and the difference between someone living and dying is what happens in the first 12 minutes of transport. She looked at him directly, not at the window. At him. In the past 2 years, we have lost 11 patients during transport. Not because of equipment failure, not because response times were slow, because the emergency protocols our medical staff use in the air were designed for hospital floors. And a hospital floor and the back of a moving helicopter are not the same environment. Everett said nothing. In a hospital, she continued, you have space, stability, relative quiet, time measured in minutes rather than seconds. In the air, you have 18 inches of lateral clearance, constant vibration that affects both the patient's physiology and the clinician's fine motor control, rotor noise that makes verbal communication unreliable, and pressure changes that alter the way medications behave in the bloodstream. She folded her hands in her lap, not nervously, the way a person folds their hands when they are being precise. Our protocols don't account for any of that. We are executing correct procedures in the wrong sequence for the wrong environment. And because the procedures themselves are medically sound, no one has stopped to question the sequence. He looked out the window. The courthouse was gone. Atlanta was spread below them, organized and accidental at the same time. You know about Harwick, he said, not a question. I know everything about Harwick, Vivian said. I know what the incident report on file says. I also know that the report does not match the medication order timestamps that a third party obtained through a data access request 18 months ago. She met his eyes. I know you signed a confidentiality agreement that has prevented you from defending yourself in any form. I know you have been running a community clinic on Farwell Avenue for 6 years, and I know you closed that clinic this morning because it was included in your divorce settlement. A pause. I did not come to that courthouse because you are a man with nothing to lose. I came because you are the most qualified person I could find, and because I believe the record on you is wrong. He was quiet for a long moment. What exactly are you asking me to do? Redesign our in-flight emergency protocols from the ground up. Work with my team. Observe, assess, rebuild. She did not look away. And if we find what I believe we will find in those old Harwick files, we deal with that too. He looked at his hands, the hands that had been accused of killing a man, the hands that had spent the last 6 years doing nothing more complex than suturing minor lacerations and checking blood pressure readings on Farwell Avenue. I'm not making any promises about what I'll find, he said. Neither am I, Vivian said. That's why I need someone honest. The helicopter banked south, and Everett Caldwell, for the first time in 9 years, did not look away from where he was going. Everett Caldwell had grown up on the south side of Atlanta in a neighborhood that the city's promotional materials had stopped mentioning sometime in the late 90s and hadn't found reason to revisit. His father worked long-haul freight. His mother taught 3rd grade at an elementary school 2 blocks from their house and brought her students' drawings home and taped them to the refrigerator because she said a child's drawing on a refrigerator was the surest sign a house was still alive. He had been a serious child, not grim, not joyless, focused. The kind of child who finds something and holds on to it until he understands it completely before moving to the next thing. He found medicine at 14 in a high school biology class that covered the circulatory system in a way that made something click behind his eyes that had never clicked before. The idea that the body was a system, that systems had logic, that logic once understood could be applied, that applying it correctly could mean the difference between a person living and dying. He was not romantic about it, not drawn to the idea of being a healer in any mystical sense. He was drawn to the precision, the stakes, the way that medicine at its best was the most consequential application of careful thinking that a human being could perform. He got to Harwick Medical Center on a full scholarship and 2 part-time jobs, in the kind of relentless focus that leaves very little room for much else. He married Serena in his 3rd year of residency. She was finishing a business administration degree and had a laugh that rearranged rooms and an energy that he had found in those early years genuinely magnetic. Nadia was born 2 years later. For a while, the life he had built felt like something real, something that was going to hold. Then came the night of March 14th. The patient's name was Leonard Pruitt, 47 years old, construction foreman, brought into Harwick on a stretcher at 9:22 in the evening after a workplace accident had introduced a falling steel beam to his midsection in a way his body was not designed to accommodate. Severe internal bleeding, multiple organ involvement. The kind of case that got paged to Everett because the residents on call that night had looked at each other and silently agreed this particular situation required someone who had been here before. Everett had been here before. He scrubbed in at 9:47. The room was already in motion around him. His team, his people, the scrub nurse who could anticipate his next move before he made it, the anesthesiologist who had worked alongside him on 40-something cases and communicated in the shorthand of people who have stood in the same room at 2 in the morning and made hard decisions together. He looked at the vitals. He looked at the imaging. He made his assessment. He began. For the first 90 minutes, the surgery went the way surgery goes, when the surgeon knows what he is doing, and the team has worked together long enough to function like a single organism. Efficient, calibrated, not easy, controlled. Then, at 11:47 in the evening, Leonard Pruitt's blood pressure dropped in a way that changed the calculation. Everett looked at the numbers, looked at the tissue, looked at the blood panel that had come back 20 minutes earlier. He made a decision. He called for a specific anticoagulant. The decision was built on 3 converging data points and 9 years of surgical experience, and the kind of certainty that comes not from confidence, but from comprehension. He administered the medication. He continued. Leonard Pruitt died on the table at 12:51 in the morning, not because of the medication Everett had ordered, because the internal damage was extensive, and the body after a certain point runs out of ways to compensate. Because sometimes a person comes in hurt badly enough that the best surgical team in the state cannot change the outcome. Because medicine is not magic. Everett called the time of death, removed his gloves, stood in the scrub room afterward, and looked at the wall. He had lost patients before. Not many, but some. Each time it left the same residue. Not guilt exactly, not failure. Something harder to name. The weight of having been in the room when a life ended and being unable to say with certainty whether anything could have changed it. He went home at 2 in the morning. He was back at 7:30 when the chief of medicine called him in. The incident report had been filed. Everett read it standing at the desk while the chief watched him with the expression of a man who had been in this room before and did not enjoy it. The report said Everett had ordered the wrong anticoagulant protocol. It said he had proceeded against explicit warnings from the surgical team. It said his clinical judgment had been compromised in ways the report did not specify beyond that phrase. He read it again. Then he set it down very carefully. "This is not what happened," he said. "The matter is under internal review," the chief said. "I would like to see the original medication log, the time-stamped order records, the anesthesiologist's documented notes." "That's not how the review process works." "I understand that. I would like to see the records." A pause. "The matter is under internal review," the chief said again. "Chief." 14 days later, Everett was called back. A different document waited on the desk. A mutual separation agreement. A confidentiality clause covering the circumstances of his departure and any related clinical events from the preceding 60 days. A deadline 48 hours to sign. If he declined, the hospital would pursue formal disciplinary action and refer the matter to the state medical board. He sat with that for a long time. He had a wife, he had a daughter who was 2 years old and had learned to say his name 6 weeks ago and said it approximately 40 times a day in the wondering tone of someone who could not quite believe this particular person belonged to her. He had no proof. He signed. He left Harwick on a Thursday afternoon with a box of personal items and the agreement in his pocket and a question settling into him like weather settling into a season. Had he killed Leonard Pruitt? He did not believe he had. He knew what he had ordered. He knew why. He knew the logic of the decision and the data that supported it and the way the decision had felt in the moment, not like uncertainty but like clarity. He knew all of that, but the report said otherwise. And the report was the record. And he had signed an agreement that prevented him from disputing that record in any forum, public or private. So the question had no answer, and it lived in him quietly for 9 years. He opened the clinic on Farwell Avenue 3 years after leaving Harwick. No surgical suite, no complex cases. Basic care for the people the hospital system had decided weren't profitable enough to fully serve. Hypertension checks, wound care, diabetes management, prenatal guidance for women who couldn't afford the downtown clinics. It wasn't what he had trained for. Every morning, he unlocked the clinic door and looked at the folding chairs in the waiting room and the secondhand equipment and the stack of intake forms that needed processing before noon. And he knew that this was not the life the version of himself at 24 had imagined. But it was something. It was the only form of medicine he still trusted himself to practice. Then the marriage started to end. It had been ending for a while before either of them said so directly. Serena had wanted more than the clinic, more than the Southside apartment and the modest income, and the man who came home tired and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a silence she had at some point stopped trying to fill. He did not blame her entirely. He blamed Preston Voss, but that came later. The divorce took 18 months, not bitter in the theatrical sense, methodical, strategic. Preston was very good at methodical and strategic. By the end, the clinic was gone. The savings were divided. And on a Tuesday morning in October, a judge awarded Everett Caldwell primary residential custody of his daughter, split the remaining assets, and closed the file, which was how he ended up on the courthouse steps with his hand in an empty pocket. The Meridian Air Medical Operations Center was 20 minutes outside the city, a low, wide building. Practical. 3 helicopter pads flanking the east side, a training hangar large enough to fit a full medical simulation unit with room to spare. The kind of facility that looked from the outside like a place where people came to work rather than to be seen working. Everett noticed that. It mattered. He showed up on his first morning in a collared shirt and dark pants with a legal pad and 2 pens. He had not owned a briefcase in years. He did not go out and buy one. Rowan Tate met him at the entrance. Rowan was 44, broad-shouldered. He moved through space with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent years in environments where unnecessary movement was a liability. 8 years as a field medic with the Army before going back for his medical degree. 6 years running Meridian's medical operations. He had built the team himself, trained most of them himself, and the handshake he offered Everett at the entrance had the quality of a test rather than a greeting. "I want to be straight with you," Rowan said. They were walking the corridor toward the operations floor. He said it without preamble, the way he apparently said most things. "I think Miss Holt made this decision for reasons that have more to do with your story than your qualifications. A surgeon who left Harwick under a cloud consulting on emergency protocols, that's a gap I'd normally want addressed before someone walked through that door." "I didn't surrender my license," Everett said. "I signed a separation agreement under duress and without access to my own records. The license itself was never formally revoked." Rowan looked at him. "Those are not the same outcome." "Correct," Everett said. "They are not." Rowan held that for a moment. Then he pushed open the door to the operations floor and didn't respond, which told Everett 2 things. First, Rowan was sharp enough to recognize the distinction even if he wasn't ready to accept it yet. Second, he was a man who let results settle arguments rather than words. That was a man Everett could work with. He spent the first week saying almost nothing. He sat in on simulation drills. He watched the team run mock trauma scenarios inside the helicopter training unit, a full-scale aircraft mock-up mounted on a hydraulic platform that could simulate flight movement turbulence and pressure variation. He observed the way the paramedics moved inside the simulated cabin, the way the physicians made decisions, the sequence in which they reached for equipment, the small hesitations that accumulated under the combined pressure of simulated movement and simulated urgency. He filled his legal pad with notes and kept them to himself. What he found by the end of that first week was not a failure of skill. Every person on Rowan's team was competent. Several were exceptional. The paramedic named Cassie, who could start a line with one hand while bracing against simulated turbulence with her elbow. The flight physician named Marcus, who made triage calls with the calm of someone who had learned to separate urgency from panic. Good people. Trained people. The problem was structural, and it was the same problem buried in every incident report, dressed in different details. The protocols they were using had been written for a hospital floor. On a hospital floor, you have space, a stable surface, colleagues within shouting distance, equipment organized by category, time measured in minutes. In the back of a moving helicopter, you have approximately 18 inches of usable clearance on either side of the patient litter. You have constant vibration that degrades fine motor precision in ways that compound over time. You have rotor noise at a frequency that makes normal speech nearly inaudible, which means verbal confirmation of medication orders. A cornerstone of safe hospital protocol becomes an unreliable mechanism. You have altitude and pressure changes that alter absorption rates for several common emergency medications. And you have a ceiling on the number of hands available and the number of moves any one person can make before reaching for the next piece of equipment. In that environment, the sequence of intervention mattered as much as the intervention itself. And the sequence the team was using had been borrowed wholesale from a context that shared almost none of the physical constraints of where they were actually working. They were executing correct medicine in the wrong order for the wrong room. And no one had questioned the order because the medicine was correct. And when the medicine is correct, it is very easy to assume the problem must lie somewhere else. Everett brought his findings to Rowan on a Friday afternoon. He laid the legal pad on the table and walked through what he had found, methodically, without editorializing. He proposed a revised framework, risk classification, and patient triage in the first 90 seconds of flight before any intervention was initiated. Hemorrhage control prioritized above airway management in specific trauma categories where blood pressure drop was the primary threat. And a complete reorganization of the emergency supply bag according to one principle: sequential single-hand access rather than categorical storage. Right now, the bags were organized the way hospital crash carts are organized by category. In the back of a moving helicopter, that meant a clinician might need to reach past 6 items to get to the 7th using both hands while the aircraft moved beneath them. The new design meant the first thing you needed was at the top, the second thing directly beneath it, and so on. Logical. The kind of insight that seems obvious in retrospect and stays invisible until someone sits with the problem long enough to actually see it. Rowan looked at the proposal for a long time without speaking. "Run it in simulation," he said finally. "Monday morning." Everett nodded. He gathered his legal pad and walked back to his office, which was a repurposed storage room with one window facing the helicopter pads and a desk that someone had found in a hallway and moved in without comment. He sat down and looked out the window at the pads. One of the helicopters was being run through its nightly check rotors, turning slowly against the dark Georgia sky. He thought about Nadia. She was at a friend's house that evening. He would pick her up at 7. She would talk for the entire 40-minute drive home about whatever had happened in the particular social architecture of 6th grade, and he would listen and ask questions and feel alongside the ordinary texture of that conversation, the particular gratitude of a man who has lost most things and still has the one thing that matters most. He picked her up at 7:05. She was already at the door when he pulled up, backpack over one shoulder, saying something over her to her friend, with the animated conviction of someone making a point that could not wait until morning. She got in the car and started talking before her seatbelt was buckled. He listened. He drove. The city moved past the windows in the particular way Atlanta moves at night, organized and accidental at the same time. They were 3 blocks from the apartment when Nadia stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. She looked at him with the measuring gaze she'd had since she was very small, the gaze that told you she had been watching longer than you realized. "You seem different," she said. "Different how?" She thought about it the way she thought about things that mattered completely, without rushing toward a conclusion just because one was available. "Like something moved," she said. "Inside, like furniture that got shifted." He looked at the road. "I started something new today." "Is it good?" "I think it might be," he said. "I don't know yet." She accepted this. She went back to the story she had been telling. But a few blocks later at a red light, she looked at him again. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Are we going to be okay?" The light changed. He pulled forward. He thought about the helicopter lifting off the courthouse lawn, about Vivian Holt's voice saying she believed the record on him was wrong, about the legal pad full of notes and the simulation scheduled for Monday morning, and the 9 years of a question with no answer that had been living in a locked room inside him since the morning he walked out of Harwick Hospital with a box of personal items and a silence he had never been able to break. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for one more second. Then she nodded once and went back to her backpack for her phone the way kids do when they have decided something has been settled and it's time to move on to the next thing. Everett drove the rest of the way home with both hands on the wheel and the words still sitting in his chest where he had placed it. A promise. Not to her, to himself. He had said yes, and the only thing left now was to figure out how to make it true. The apartment was on the third floor of a building that was not remarkable in any way, which was fine. Remarkable had not served him well. He made dinner, they ate, he helped Nadia with a reading assignment that she had strong opinions about, and he listened to her opinions and offered his own, and for an hour the kitchen was the kind of ordinary that he had not always appreciated when he had it, and had never stopped missing after it was gone. After she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the cold remnant of a cup of coffee in his legal pad and thought about Monday, about the simulation, about 19 minutes and what it would mean to turn that into 11, about Leonard Pruitt, 47 years old, a man who had come in on a stretcher and had not walked out, a man whose death had become the instrument of something, though Everett still did not have all the pieces of what. Not yet. He thought about Vivian Holt sitting across from him in the helicopter, saying the report does not match the timestamps. He thought about what that meant if it was true, and he sat very still in the kitchen of his rented apartment while Atlanta went dark and quiet outside the window, and he let himself for the first time in 9 years consider the possibility that the question he had been carrying was not unanswerable, that it had simply been waiting for someone to go back and look at what the records actually said. He got up, washed the coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light, stood in the dark for a moment with his hand still on the switch. Monday, he thought, one thing at a time. Then he went to bed. The simulation ran for 4 hours on Monday morning, and by the end of it, the operations floor had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected has happened and no one is quite ready to say it out loud. Everett stood at the edge of the simulation bay with his legal pad and watched the final run all the way through. The paramedic named Cassie moving through the revised sequence with the clean economy of someone who had practiced it enough times over the weekend that it was no longer a sequence, but simply what the hands did. The flight physician Marcus calling interventions in the correct order without hesitating at the transitions, which had been the problem before the small hesitations at the handoff points between one category of action and the next, each one costing seconds, the seconds adding up into minutes. The minutes being the thing that determined whether a person in the back of a helicopter over a rural county made it to the trauma center or did not. When the final scenario ended, the readout on the monitoring panel showed 11 minutes and 14 seconds from initial patient contact to stabilization of a simulated severe hemorrhage case. The previous best under the old protocol was 19 minutes and 7 seconds. No one spoke for a moment. Then Cassie looked at the readout and looked at Everett and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Rowan Tate had been standing at the far end of the bay with his arms crossed since the second scenario. He had not moved. He had not reacted visibly to anything, not to the pediatric trauma run that had completed in under 8 minutes, not to the airway management sequence that had eliminated 2 redundant steps without losing any safety checkpoint, and not to the hemorrhage scenario that had just produced a number that did not match anything in the operational history of this facility. He stood there a moment longer after the final timer stopped. Then he walked across the bay to where Everett was standing. He looked at the readout. He looked at Everett. The team didn't change, he said. No. The equipment didn't change. No. Rowan was quiet for a moment. 19 minutes and 7 seconds. That was our best. For 6 years. He said it without self-pity, without defensiveness, in the flat tone of a man examining a fact he does not enjoy, but is unwilling to look away from. I thought that was just how long it took. It wasn't, Everett said. The sequence was adding time that the environment was creating. Change the sequence and the environment stops working against you. Rowan nodded once. He did not apologize for what he had said at the entrance on the first morning. Everett had not expected him to. But something had shifted between them, and both of them could feel it, the particular realignment that happens between two people who have measured each other and found the measurement fair. "Run it again Wednesday," Rowan said. "Full team. I want the numbers confirmed before I take this to Vivian." "They'll confirm," Everett said. Rowan looked at him. "I know," he said, and walked out. The Wednesday run produced 11 minutes and 9 seconds. The Thursday run with a different crew rotation produced 11 minutes and 22 seconds. The variation was within the margin Everett had projected based on individual fine motor calibration under simulated turbulence conditions. He documented all of it on the legal pad and transferred the numbers to a formal report that he left on Vivian Holt's desk Thursday evening with a one-page summary and no editorial commentary because the numbers were commentary enough. Vivian read it Friday morning. She sent him a message that said 2 words, "Keep going." He kept going. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week while he was cross-referencing incident reports with medication logs in the records room at the back of the operations center that he found case number 7114. He had been in the records room for 3 hours. Most of what he had found was ordinary documentation delays, transcription errors, the normal noise of a high-pressure environment where people are trying to save lives and paperwork is the thing that happens after. He was looking for patterns, looking for the shape of the problem underneath the individual cases. He pulled the file. Patient 52 years old, male, farming accident, severe blood loss, transported by Meridian from a rural county 60 miles south of Atlanta, died en route. The incident report listed cause of death as delayed clotting response following standard hemorrhage intervention. Standard. He looked at the medication log. A critical clotting agent, the one that should have been administered within the first 4 minutes of a hemorrhage of this severity, was logged as not administered. Equipment unavailable at point of critical need. He set that page down. He picked up the secondary documentation. In the back of the file, tucked behind 3 pages of transport data and a copy of the patient intake form, was a handwritten field note. The paramedic's own record. The kind of documentation that gets written on a knee in the back of a moving aircraft and stuffed into a folder because there is no better option in that moment. The handwriting was compressed and slightly uneven. The handwriting of someone writing fast in a space that was moving beneath them. It said clotting agent drawn and readied at T+3, administered per protocol. Patient response inconsistent with expected mechanism. He read it twice. Administered per protocol. The typed log said not administered. The handwritten note said administered per protocol. Same patient, same flight, same medication. 2 records, 2 different realities. Everett sat with that for a long time. And the thing that made the blood move differently through him than it had moved in years. The thing that he would think about later when he tried to describe this moment to himself in the quiet of the apartment after Nadia was asleep was not shock. It was recognition. He had seen this before, not in someone else's file, not in a case study or a training manual. In his own. 9 years ago, a typed record that said one thing. His own knowledge of what had actually happened saying something else entirely. The record winning. His knowledge losing. Him signing an agreement that prevented him from ever saying otherwise. He set the file down on the table, looked at the wall across from him. Something that had been sitting in a locked room in the back of his mind for 9 years shifted quietly the way ice shifts when the temperature changes. Not dramatic, not sudden, but irreversible. He picked up the file and walked to Vivian's office on the 4th floor. She read both pages, the typed log and the handwritten note, the way she read everything. Completely. Without the performance of urgency, which was its own kind of urgency. 4 minutes, maybe 5. Then she looked up at him. "There's more," he said. "I need to look at the supply chain. Tell me what you're looking for." "I'll know it when I find it." She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded. "You have full records access, whatever you need." What he found in the supply chain documentation took him the better part of 2 days. He was looking for the hemostatic agents, the clotting compounds loaded into the current flight kits. Standard review. making sure the equipment specified in the new protocols matched what was actually on the aircraft. Most of it checked out. Then he got to the hemostatic agents in the current batch integrated into the flight kits 6 weeks earlier. They had come through a procurement channel he did not recognize. Not the standard vendor Meridian had used for the previous 4 years. A new supplier listed on the purchase order as Vertex Clinical Partners. He had not heard of Vertex Clinical Partners. That was not by itself alarming. Supply chains shifted. Vendors changed. Procurement happened through channels he was not always privy to. But he pulled the certification data, and then he pulled the stability studies. And then he sat at his desk for a long time reading through the stability studies with the specific attention of someone who has learned through experience that the most important information in a technical document is almost never in the body of the text. The compound's clotting performance was sound under standard laboratory conditions. Room temperature, stable surface, the conditions under which the certification testing had been conducted. All of it exactly as advertised. But the stability data included a footnote, buried small, the kind of notation that gets skipped on a first pass and a second pass and possibly a third. About performance degradation under combined stresses. Sustained mechanical vibration above a specific frequency threshold. Ambient temperature variation exceeding a certain range across the duration of exposure. He looked at the frequency threshold. Then he looked at the vibration profile of a Meridian helicopter at cruising altitude, which was in the operational data he had been reviewing for weeks. Then he looked at the temperature variation data from Meridian's own flight logs, which showed an average ambient range in the patient compartment during extended transport of 21 degrees across the duration of a standard long-haul flight. He put those three things together. In a hospital, this compound worked. In a controlled environment with stable conditions and predictable temperature, it did exactly what the certification said it did. In the back of a helicopter flying 200 miles over open terrain and variable weather, it degraded. Not catastrophically, not in a way that would be obvious on the ground, or in a short transport, or in conditions that stayed within the testing parameters, but in the long hauls, in the flights to the rural counties where the distance was the entire point. In exactly the situations Meridian Air Medical was built to handle, the compound became unreliable. And unreliable in a hemorrhage scenario was the same as wrong. He wrote up the full analysis that afternoon. No editorializing, no language designed to alarm. Just the data, the comparison, and the conclusion the data produced. He took it to Vivian's office and set it on her desk and walked her through it. She read it twice. "Pull it," she said. "Today." "Today," he agreed. He went back to his office, and for about 4 hours he believed the problem was solved. The board meeting was the next afternoon. Everett had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where the decision had already been made before anyone sat down, and the conversation existed to give the decision the appearance of having been reached together. He knew the architecture of those rooms, the way certain people positioned their chairs, the way language tilted toward outcomes rather than processes. This was one of those rooms. 7 board members. 3 of them had been briefed before the meeting on the demonstration timeline and the contract value attached to it. A federal service agreement. 7 years. Expanded coverage across 4 additional states. The dollar figure attached to it was the kind of number that changes a company's trajectory. The kind of number that once it enters a conversation, starts doing its own talking. And at the end of this table, in a chair that was not officially a board seat, sat Preston Voss. This was the first time Everett had seen him since the courthouse steps. Preston was still in a suit that cost too much and still held himself with the controlled ease of a man who has spent years in rooms where he was the most strategically prepared person present. He did not acknowledge Everett's entrance. He looked at his documents and made a small notation on something with a pen and did not look up. But Everett watched him, and Everett noticed the way Preston's pen stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds when Everett set his analysis report on the table. Warren Finch spoke first. Finch was in his mid-60s, the kind of man who had learned to use his age as a credential, the authority of someone who has seen enough to be appropriately skeptical of anything new. He said it plainly in the direct tone of someone who values directness the way some people value furniture functionally, and only up to the point where it becomes inconvenient. "The agent is certified," Finch said. "The risk assessment has been conducted. I see no basis for pulling a certified product 11 days before a federal demonstration on the strength of an internal analysis prepared by a consultant with a contested professional history. Everett looked at him across the table. Then he looked at Preston Voss. Preston was looking at his documents. His pen was still. The certification was conducted in a ground laboratory under standard conditions, Everett said. I am telling you what happens to this compound in actual flight. That is not opinion. The stability data is in the report. Footnote 7, page 4. The compound degrades under the combined stress of sustained mechanical vibration and temperature variation. Both of those conditions are present in every long-haul transport this company operates. The certification body reviewed the stability data, Finch said. They approved the product. The certification body did not test it at the vibration frequency and temperature variation of a 200-mile rural transport. That combination was not in the testing parameters. He paused. I can show you the numbers. Finch looked at him steadily. You are a consultant with a contested professional history. Just that. Just that sentence placed on the table like a card being played. Everett looked at the card. He recognized what it was, and he looked for a long moment at Preston Voss, who had still not looked up from his documents. He said nothing further, because there was nothing to say that would move Warren Finch. And Everett Caldwell had not spent 9 years in the wreckage of a record used against him to come into this room and let a different record be used against him in a different room. He was not going to lose his composure. He was not going to perform. He was going to remember this moment very carefully. Vivian overruled the board on the poll. That part she had authority to do, but the replacement supply could not be sourced and certified inside 11 days. No one could move that fast through the federal certification process. It was not a failure of will. It was logistics. The compromise was the worst version of a compromise because it was not really a compromise at all. It was a postponement dressed in the language of resolution. Keep the flag product in the kits for the demonstration. Flag it for post-demonstration replacement. Proceed as planned. Everett said no. He did not have a vote. He said no anyway. He walked out of that meeting and stood in the corridor and looked at the wall and breathed, not to calm himself, but to measure himself. To verify that he was still the person he had been in that room, and not the version of himself who had signed things in offices because he had nowhere else to go. He was still that person. But he was also standing 11 days away from watching something preventable happen because the people with the authority to prevent it had decided not to. That night, he picked up Nadia from a study session at a classmate's house. She got in the car, and he could tell immediately that she was in a quiet mood, not sad, just inward, the way she sometimes got after days that had asked a lot of her. She looked out the passenger window at the passing streets. After a while, she said, "The demonstration is in 11 days. Yes. Are you ready?" He thought about that. The protocol is ready. The team is ready. But, he glanced at her. 11 years old, catching the word he had not said. There's a problem I found with some equipment. I told them about it. They decided not to address it before the demonstration. She was quiet, processing it the way she processed things that mattered without rushing toward a conclusion. So you'll be right when it goes wrong. Probably. That doesn't feel good. No, he said. It doesn't. She looked at the window for another block. But you told them. You gave them what you found, and you told them. That part was yours to do. He looked at the road. He did not say anything because there was nothing to say to that which would improve it. She leaned her head against the window. I just think that matters, she said quietly, whether or not it changes what happens. He drove the rest of the way home without speaking, and she let him. And that was one of the things about Nadia that he had recognized since she was very small, the understanding that some silences didn't need to be filled. The demonstration was on a Thursday. Clear sky. October behaving like October for once in Georgia. Cool still the air, carrying the particular clarity of a season that has finally decided to arrive. The training facility had been arranged the way federal demonstrations are arranged, with the self-consciousness of an institution that knows it is being evaluated and has organized everything to communicate that it knows how to be evaluated. Observers in a glass enclosure overlooking the field. Representatives from the Department of Health and Human Services. 2 regional emergency management directors. The full Meridian Board. A pool of credentialed press. Everett stood at the field perimeter with Rowan Tate. They had not spoken much about what was in the flight kits. Everett had told Rowan what he had found, in what the board had decided. Rowan had looked at him for a moment, then looked at the helicopter pads and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The simulation began. Multi-patient mass casualty event, various injury profiles, triage loading in-flight treatment while the ground team managed the scene. The scenario was designed to stress test both the protocol and the team simultaneously. For the first 40 minutes, it was the clearest argument Everett could have made for his own work. The revised protocol ran cleanly. The team moved through triage at a pace that drew visible reactions from the observation enclosure above. A pediatric trauma scenario, historically the weakest point in the old protocol, where the sequence had always tended to break down under the added pressure of a smaller patient and different physiological parameters, was handled in under 8 minutes, from the moment the helicopter touched down to the moment the simulated patient was stabilized. Rowan said nothing beside him. He didn't need to. Then the hemorrhage scenario began. Simulated patient, severe abdominal trauma, active blood loss. The flight medic reached into the kit and initiated the hemostatic intervention according to protocol. The sequence was correct. The dosage was correct. The timing was correct. Every decision the medic made was the right decision based on the best available information. 90 seconds in the biological test model, a standardized tissue analog used for high-fidelity training simulations began showing signs of abnormal coagulation response. Clotting occurring in the wrong tissue zone, diffuse rather than targeted. Not what the compound's mechanism was designed to produce. Exactly the pattern Everett had predicted based on the stability data and the vibration profile and the temperature logs and 45 minutes of reading a footnote that no one else had read to the end. The lead physician on the scenario looked at the readings, looked at the tissue model, called a halt. The field went quiet. Not the quiet of a pause, the quiet of a thing going wrong in front of people who were paid to assess whether things went wrong. Everett stood at the perimeter and felt the particular stillness of a man watching something preventable occur because the people with the power to prevent it had decided the prevention was too expensive. He had told them. He had shown them the data and written the analysis and said this would happen and been told he was a consultant with a contested professional history. He stood there and did not move. It was not the first time he had felt this stillness. It might not be the last, but he was still standing, and he was not signing anything. By 6 o'clock that evening, 2 regional health industry publications had run the story. Everett read it on his phone in the parking lot sitting in Rowan's borrowed car because that had apparently become the location where significant things happened to him. The story named him. Of course it did. Everett Caldwell, former surgical attending at Harwick Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Patient death. License dispute. And now the consultant behind the flawed protocol that had failed in front of federal observers at Meridian Air Medical's demonstration for a major government contract. Discredited, the story called him. Not alleged, not reportedly. Discredited. He read it twice. Then he put the phone down on the seat and looked at the Atlanta skyline going orange and gray at the edges and focused on the logistics. The demonstration had ended at 12:46 in the afternoon. The story had published at 6:02 in the evening. 6 hours, which was fast. Specifically fast given that the information in the story was not available from the observer enclosure. Equipment names. The exact nature of the coagulation failure. Internal timeline data that had not been released through any official channel. The kind of detail you know if you were inside that building, working the case with access to the operations data in real time. Whoever had given the reporter what they needed to write this story had been inside that building and had transmitted the information within hours of the demonstration ending. That was not a journalist doing good work. That was a pipeline. Someone had set it up in advance, had been waiting for the failure, had been ready to move the moment it happened, which meant they had known the failure was coming, which meant they had known what was in those kits. Everett sat in the car and looked at the skyline and thought about Preston Voss standing on the courthouse steps on a Tuesday morning in October. The way his face had gone carefully neutral when Vivian Holt's helicopter descended onto the courthouse lawn. Not surprised, not curious, managing information he already possessed. Processing, calculating, running numbers on something he had not expected to need to run numbers on that morning. Everett had seen that expression in that moment and filed it under notable without knowing exactly why. He knew why now. He sat there for a while longer, long enough for the skyline to finish going dark, long enough to let the full shape of it assemble in his mind without forcing it, the way a differential diagnosis assembles when you stop trying to reach a conclusion and just let the symptoms speak in the order they present. Vertex Clinical Partners, a procurement channel no one at Meridian could trace to a recognizable origin. A compound that worked perfectly in a laboratory and degraded precisely in the conditions where Meridian actually operated. A press contact preloaded with internal data published within 6 hours of the failure. Preston Voss on the courthouse steps with a face that had already run the calculation before the helicopter landed. 2 events, same mechanism, same purpose, same hand. He picked up his phone. He scrolled to a number he had kept in his contacts for 9 years without calling. Had looked at occasionally in the early years, then stopped looking at, because looking at it made the question feel closer than he could manage. The name was Dottie Pierce. She had been the charge nurse on the surgical floor at Harwick Hospital the night Leonard Pruitt died. She had worked alongside Everett for 4 years before that night, long enough that he knew she took her coffee with cream and no sugar, and kept a photograph of her nephew taped inside her locker door, and did her job with a steady, unshowy precision that he had always trusted the way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to. 2 weeks after he signed the separation agreement and left Harwick, a text had arrived from a number he didn't recognize. It said, "I know you didn't do what they said. I'm sorry, I can't say more right now." He had saved the number. He had figured out whose it was. He had never called back because calling back meant opening something he wasn't sure he had the ground beneath him to open. He looked at the name on his screen now. Then he pressed call. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "I always wondered," she said. Her voice was older, not fragile, just older in the way voices get when years have moved through them and left something settled behind. "I always wondered if you'd call." "I need to ask you something," Everett said, "and I need you to tell me the truth whatever it costs, because what I'm about to tell you means this is already past the point where either of us staying quiet does anything useful." He told her everything. The restored access inquiry Vivian had referenced, the case 7-114 field note against the typed record, Vertex Clinical Partners, the demonstration, the press story with internal data published 6 hours after the failure, Preston Voss on the courthouse steps with a face that had already run the numbers. He laid it out the way he laid out findings in sequence without dramatizing it, because the facts assembled in order were dramatic enough on their own. When he finished, the line was quiet. Just the sound of 2 people on either end of 9 years of silence, and somewhere in the background on her end, a television turned down low. Then Dottie Pierce said 4 words. "I kept a copy." Everett went very still. "Of what?" he said, though his body already knew. "The access logs," she said. "From that night, the floor system ran automated backup logs every 4 hours. It was an old protocol. Most of the staff didn't even know it was still running by then. I pulled the 4 a.m. printout before anyone came around to ask what had been printed." A pause, long enough that he could hear her deciding something. "I've had it in a safety deposit box since that March," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it. I had family depending on me. No lawyer, no one I trusted to know what the right move was. I told myself I'd find the right moment." "The right moment," Everett said quietly, "is right now." A beat of silence. "I know it is," she said. "I've known for a while now." He was already reaching for the door handle before she finished speaking. Then he stopped, sat back, took a breath, not out of calm, out of discipline. There were things that needed to happen in the right order. Rowan's car, the apartment, Nadia, and then in the morning, whatever came next. "Can you get to it tonight?" he asked. "I can get to it right now," Dottie said, and the steadiness in her voice, the voice of a woman who had been holding something for 9 years and had just been given permission to put it down, told him everything he needed to know about what the next 24 hours were going to look like. He drove home. The radio stayed off. Nadia was at a neighbor's house until 8. He had time. He parked the car and went upstairs and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Nadia did her homework and had strong opinions about geography, and had asked him on the night this all began whether things were going to be okay. He thought about what he had told her. He thought about the 9 years between the night Leonard Pruitt died and this evening in a borrowed car in a parking lot, watching Atlanta go dark. He thought about Preston Voss and a press pipeline in a compound that degraded in exactly the conditions where Meridian operated, and a face on courthouse steps that had already run the calculation. And for the first time since the morning he walked out of Harwick with a box of his things and a question. With no answer, Everett Caldwell stopped asking what he might have done wrong. He started asking who had decided he had. Dottie Pierce drove to the bank that same evening. She did not wait until morning. She did not call ahead to ask whether the safety deposit room would still be accessible at that hour. She simply got in her car and drove the way people drive when they have been waiting a long time to do something, and the waiting is finally over, and the only thing left is the doing of it. She photographed every page of the access log under the fluorescent light of the bank's back room. The light was harsh and a little cold and made everything look more official than it probably needed to look, but that was all right. Official was what they needed. She sent the images to Everett at 10:47 in the evening. 43 images in sequence, each one clear. Each one timestamped by her phone's camera. Each one a page of a document that the automated floor system at Harwick Hospital had generated at 4 o'clock in the morning 9 years ago, and that no one had thought to ask about because no one had known it existed. No one except Dottie Pierce, who had known it existed and had pulled it and had kept it in a safety deposit box for 9 years because she did not know what else to do with it and could not bring herself to throw it away. Everett was at the kitchen table when the images arrived. He opened the first one, then the second. He read slowly the way he had learned to read data, without a conclusion waiting at the end, without deciding in advance what he was going to find before he found it. You read the way you approach a patient, openly, letting the evidence speak in the order it presents. The medication order for the anticoagulant he had called for during Leonard Pruitt's surgery appeared in the original order log at 11:47 in the evening. His name, his access credentials, the exact medication, the exact dosage. Timestamped at 11:47 p.m. He had ordered it. It was there in the original record exactly as he had always known it to be. He kept reading. At 3:14 in the morning, 2 hours and 23 minutes after Leonard Pruitt had been pronounced dead, 2 hours and 23 minutes after Everett had removed his gloves and stood in the scrub room and looked at the wall, 2 hours and 23 minutes after the case was closed and the room had been cleared, and Everett had driven home through empty streets and walked into an apartment where Nadia was asleep, and no one knew yet that by morning everything would be different. The same entry had been modified. Order status changed from administered to not indicated. He looked at the modification record. The change had been made from an administrative account, not a physician's account, not a nurse's workstation, not any clinical terminal in any part of the hospital that had legitimate access to a patient's medication orders at any hour. An administrative account registered to Harwick's Operations Management Division. Back office, scheduling, facilities coordination. The kind of account that handled room assignments and vendor contracts and had no reason, no legitimate conceivable defensible reason to touch a surgical medication record ever, let alone at 3:14 in the morning, let alone on a chart belonging to a man who had been dead for 2 hours and 23 minutes. Everett set the phone down on the table. He did not move for a long time. Outside, Atlanta was quiet the way cities go quiet after midnight. Not silent, just reduced. A car passing on the street below, a dog somewhere 2 blocks over. The particular texture of a city at rest that is never fully resting. 9 years. 9 years of waking at 4 in the morning with a question pressing on him from the inside. 9 years of the clinic on Farwell Avenue and the careful, limited work that was the only work he still believed he was safe to do. 9 years of a marriage slowly losing pressure, like a tire with a slow leak not blowing out, just getting flatter until one morning the ride had changed, and it had been changing for longer than he realized. 9 years of Nadia growing up with a father who showed up and coached her soccer team and helped her with homework and carried underneath all of it a weight she was too young to see and he was too proud to name. He had not made a mistake, not on the night of March 14th, not in the operating room, not in the decision that the report had described as compromised judgment. He had made the right call in a room where the call mattered. The patient had died anyway, because sometimes patients die anyway, because the body reaches a point where no intervention changes what is coming. Someone had sat at a computer at 3:14 in the morning and reached into a dead man's chart and change the record to say otherwise. Someone had done that deliberately with a specific account at a specific time while Everett was at home asleep, while the night was still dark, while nothing in the world yet indicated that by the time he woke up, the story of what had happened in that operating room would already have been rewritten without him. He sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, not unable to move, unwilling to rush past what he was sitting with. Leonard Pruitt deserved that much, a man who had come into Harwick on a stretcher on a March night and had not walked out, a man whose death had been real regardless of what happened to the record attached to it, regardless of who had sat at a terminal in the early hours of the morning and decided to rewrite the story of that night. The death was real. It had always been real. What the access log changed was not the fact of the death, but the story told about the why. And the why had mattered to 9 years of a question with no answer, had mattered to 11 patients who had been transported in aircraft running protocols that should have been updated years ago, but hadn't been because the person who understood the problem most clearly had been removed from any room where he could raise it, had mattered to a marriage that ran out of ground, and a clinic that got folded into a settlement like a coupon, in an apartment on the 3rd floor of an unremarkable building where a man sat alone at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning, holding the evidence of his own innocence in his hands. He got up, made coffee he did not drink, stood at the kitchen window looking at the street below. Then he went to bed because tomorrow was going to require him to be the clearest version of himself, and the clearest version of himself required sleep. He was at Vivian Holt's office at 7 o'clock the next morning. Not 7:30, not 7:15. 7. He had been awake since 4. Not restless, not anxious awake in the way you are awake when something has shifted and sleep no longer has a full claim on you because the thing that needed doing had declared itself and was waiting. Vivian was already there, coffee on her desk, a legal pad with notes in her compressed handwriting, the alertness behind her eyes of someone who had not slept particularly well because she had been running calculations instead. He set his phone on her desk with the access log images open on the screen and walked her through it without preamble. The original order at 11:47, the modification at 3:14, the administrative account with no clinical access and no documented reason to be anywhere near a surgical medication record at any hour, let alone that one. The fact that the original digital record had been recoverable at all, which meant the modification had been made on top of the original data, rather than replacing it, which meant someone had been careless or confident or both. Vivian read it the way she read everything, completely, without the performance of urgency. 4 minutes. She turned the phone once to see a section more clearly. Then she set it down and looked at him. "This is 9 years old," she said, "preserved on a floor backup log that an automated system generated at 4 a.m. before anyone thought about what had been printed." She looked at the document again, not because she had missed something, because she was making a decision and was verifying, as she always did, that the decision she was about to make was the one she actually meant. "I'm making 3 calls this morning," she said. "Give me the day." He went back to work. He reviewed updated training documentation. He responded to a question from Cassie about the revised triage sequencing. He ate lunch at his desk. He did these things with the focused calm of someone who has placed something important in trustworthy hands and understands that the next step belongs to someone else. And the only productive response to that is to keep working. By that evening, Vivian's legal team had begun the process of tracing Vertex Clinical Partners. It took 72 hours. They started with the name on the purchase order, the vendor nobody at Meridian could trace to a recognizable origin, and worked backward through the public record with the methodical patience of people who do this for a living and understand that the architecture of concealment is never as solid as it looks from the outside. There are always seams. You just have to know where to press. The Delaware registration incorporation date 4 years earlier, 2 years before the current procurement contract. Registered agent, a law firm with offices in Atlanta and Birmingham. Small, discreet. The kind of practice that did corporate formation work for clients who preferred that the work not call attention to itself. The law firm's client relationships, traced through disclosure filings and retainer agreements logged in the public record, included among their clients a pharmaceutical distribution group operating across the southeastern United States. Mid-size regional. Not a household name, but not invisible. the kind of company that moved product between manufacturers and hospital systems and did very well in the space between. That pharmaceutical distribution group had retained Preston Voss as outside counsel for more than 9 years. Everett read that line 3 times when the legal team put it in front of him. He read it the way you read something that confirms what you already understood, but had not yet seen written down, with the particular quality of recognition that is different from surprise, because surprise implies you didn't see it coming, and recognition implies you did at some level in some part of yourself that assembles patterns before the conscious mind catches up. Preston Voss, the man in the charcoal suit on the courthouse steps, the man whose face had gone carefully neutral when Vivian's helicopter descended onto the courthouse lawn. The man who had structured Serena's divorce settlement with a precision that Everett now understood had been operating from a more complete map of the territory than his client had ever seen. Outside counsel, for more than 9 years, for a pharmaceutical distribution company that had, through a registered agent, through a small discreet law firm, through a Delaware entity incorporated 4 years ago, supplied Billionaire Medical with a hemostatic compound that performed exactly as Everett had described. It would perform degrading under vibration and heat in a helicopter on the day of a federal demonstration, 6 hours before a story ran naming Everett Caldwell as a discredited consultant responsible for a failed protocol. And 9 years earlier, Preston had been lead counsel for the same distribution group's parent operation as they prepared to bring a new anticoagulant therapy to market across the regional surgical center landscape. High cost, high margin. The kind of launch that generates significant and sustained revenue if it becomes the standard of care. The kind of launch that requires a clear runway. No competing approaches. No protocol changes at the hospital level that would redirect clinical decision-making away from the new product. Everett had been in those same months developing and presenting a protocol within Harwick's surgical department, a systematic approach to managing complex hemorrhage cases. Evidence-based, designed to reduce unnecessary pharmacological intervention and concentrate treatment where it was most needed. The kind of protocol that, if adopted as a regional standard, would have significantly reduced the patient population for whom the new anticoagulant therapy would be prescribed. Preston Voss had not been hired to destroy Everett Caldwell. He had been hired to protect a product launch. Everett was a line in a risk assessment. The mechanism for neutralizing that risk was already built into the institutional structure of Harwick Hospital. A death on the operating table. A record modified from an administrative account in the early hours of the morning. An incident report drafted to produce a specific outcome rather than document what had actually occurred. A separation agreement with a confidentiality clause. And Everett Caldwell, 48 hours after Leonard Pruitt was pronounced dead, signing his own silence because he had a 2-year-old daughter and no proof and nowhere else to turn. The mechanism was clean, quiet, entirely deniable. And it had worked for 9 years. Until Vivian Holt landed a helicopter on a courthouse lawn. Everett went to Preston Voss's office on a Thursday morning before the building's administrative staff arrived. He had told no one he was going. Not Vivian, not Rowan. He drove Rowan's borrowed car. That detail would have been almost funny under different circumstances, and parked on the street and took the elevator to the 4th floor and walked down the corridor to the corner office at the end. Preston was already there. He was at his desk with a cup of coffee and a document he had been reading, and he looked up when Everett came through the door without the particular surprise of a man who had not been expecting this visit, which told Everett something. Preston had known this moment was coming. He had simply not known exactly when. The office was what you would expect from a man who understood that environments communicated things before anyone spoke. Ordered. Considered. The kind of room that said its occupant was in control of his circumstances and had been for a long time. Everett did not sit down. He walked to the desk and placed a printed copy of the access log, the 314 modification, the administrative account, the timestamp on the surface in front of Preston, and stood back. Preston looked at the document. He read it without rushing, which was its own kind of statement. Then he looked up. "Dr. Caldwell," he said. His voice carried the same controlled ease it had always carried. The ease of a man who has spent years in rooms where he was the most strategically prepared person present and has come to rely on that as a fixed condition of his existence. "You're a consultant with a contested professional history." "Not anymore," Everett said. He held Preston's gaze for a moment long enough for both of them to understand that the ground had shifted and that Preston Voss was now the one standing on the side of the table where the options were narrowing. Then he picked up the document and walked out of the office and down the corridor and into the elevator and out through the lobby and back to the borrowed car on the street. He drove back to Meridian. He went to his office. He sat down and opened his legal pad and kept working. He was not going to be the instrument of what happened next. That belonged to other people in other rooms with the authority and the mechanisms to do what needed to be done. His part had been to find it and name it and place it in front of the people who could act on it. That part was done. Vivian presented the full evidence package to the U.S. Attorney's Office on a Monday morning. She went herself, did not send the legal team in ahead of her. She walked into the federal building in downtown Atlanta with the documentation in a folder and her attorneys at her side and the composure of a woman who had built something real. Watched someone try to take it apart from the inside and was now placing the evidence of that attempt on a federal desk. The board met 48 hours later. Warren Finch had resigned before the meeting convened, not after. Before. His resignation letter had been delivered to Vivian's office at 7 o'clock in the morning. 2 paragraphs, no explanation. The letter of a man who could read where something was going and had decided not to be present when it arrived. The board voted unanimously. Full restoration of Everett's advisory access. A formal request to the Federal Demonstration Oversight Body to reschedule pending protocol review. A motion passed without dissent to issue a press statement correcting the record on the demonstration failure. Rowan knocked on Everett's office door that same evening at 6:15 after the building had mostly cleared. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the machine down the hall. He held one out without saying anything. Everett took it. Rowan sat in the chair across the desk. He did not arrange himself. He sat the way people sit when they have decided that what they need to say matters more than how they look saying it. "I've been running operations here for 6 years," he said. "We've lost 11 people, and I've been telling myself it was the environment, the distances, the nature of the cases, the inherent difficulty of the work." He stopped, looked at the cup in his hands. "I wasn't wrong about any of that, but I was using all of it to avoid the question I should have been asking from the start." Everett waited. "I said what I said to you on the first morning," Rowan said. "I stand behind the reasoning. I don't stand behind the conclusion." "The reasoning was logical given what you had," Everett said. "The information was incomplete." "Yes?" Rowan looked at him steadily. "That's the whole problem, isn't it? 9 years of it. Making judgments from an incomplete record and the record winning." "Yes," Everett said. "That's the whole problem." Rowan drank his coffee. After a while, he said, "The rescheduled demonstration is 6 weeks out. The protocol will be ready." Rowan nodded. He stood and walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. He looked back. 7 minutes, 44 seconds, he said. "That pediatric scenario. I looked up the previous best under the old protocol after the first simulation." He shook his head slightly. 16 minutes and change. For years. I thought that was just how long it took." A pause. "It wasn't. We just didn't know to question it." He walked out. Everett looked at the window at the dark Georgia sky and the helicopter pads and the lights of the aircraft running their nightly checks and thought about 16 minutes and what it meant to turn that into 7. About the people who had been in those transports in the space between those numbers. Harwick Hospital issued its formal statement on a Wednesday, 11 days after the indictment paperwork had been filed. 2 paragraphs. The hospital acknowledged that the incident report filed following the death of Leonard Pruitt had contained inaccuracies that did not reflect the documented clinical record. It acknowledged that modifications made to the original medication order log had not been the work of the attending surgical physician. It stated clearly that Dr. Everett Caldwell bore no clinical responsibility for the death of Leonard Pruitt. 2 paragraphs, 9 years. Everett read it on a Wednesday evening in his kitchen after Nadia had gone to bed. He read it sitting at the table under the overhead light with the apartment quiet around him. He read both paragraphs twice. Then he set his phone face down on the table and looked at the wall. He thought about Leonard Pruitt the way he always thought about him, with the sorrow of someone who could not change what had happened, and the clarity of someone who now knew it was not what the record had said it was. Both things at once, not resolved into something clean, just held together. The way you hold things too large to put down and too real to pretend away. Leonard Pruitt had died on that table. That was true. had always been true, would remain true regardless of what any statement said. What the statement corrected was the story told about why, and the why had mattered to more than just Everett Caldwell. He sat there for a while. Then he stood up, washed his coffee cup, and went to bed. He called Dottie Pierce the next morning. She answered on the second ring. "I saw the statement," she said. "I know." He paused. "I needed to call." A silence. Not uncomfortable, the silence of two people who have arrived at the same place from different roads and are taking a moment to register that they are both standing there. "I did it 9 years late," she said. "You did it when you could," he said. "That counts." Another silence. The silence of a person who has spent 9 years asking herself whether it counted and has not yet fully settled on an answer. Then Dottie said something Everett had not known, something she had not included in their conversation the night he called her from the parking lot. She had known something was wrong on the night itself, had seen people moving in and out of the records area at 3 in the morning, people whose names she recognized, people whose presence in that part of the building at that hour had no clinical justification she could account for. She had noted the name she saw on the terminal screen when she passed the open door. She had recognized that the name did not match anyone who should have been accessing a surgical record at that time. She had reported it to her floor supervisor the next morning. Her supervisor had told her the matter was being reviewed internally. 3 weeks later, Dottie had been reassigned to night rotation on a different floor without explanation, and no one had mentioned her report again. "I was going to do more," she said. "I told myself I was going to find a way to do more. But I had people depending on me, and I didn't know who to trust. And after a while, it started to feel like the moment had passed." A pause. "I've thought about that a lot. Whether I made the right call." "You made the call you could make with what you had," Everett said. "So did you." He let that sit. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Not about this, in general." She made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "I retired 2 years ago. I have a garden. My nephew visits on weekends." Another pause, softer this time. "I'm okay, Dr. Caldwell. I think I'm actually okay." "Good," he said. "I'm glad." He meant it in the uncomplicated way you mean something when the situation is simplified down to what actually matters, which is just that a person who deserved to be okay had managed to get there. Preston Voss was indicted on a Thursday morning, 11 weeks after the board meeting at Meridian. Wire fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to falsify medical records. 3 counts federal, the kind of charges that come with a press release, and a set of bullet points that reduce years of calculated damage to lines of legal language. Everett read the press release once in his office between a training review and a meeting with the rescheduled demonstration planning team. He read it the way you read something you have been waiting for long enough that by the time it arrives, it feels less like relief and more like the closing of an account that had been running too long. He did not feel triumphant. He had expected to, or had expected to feel something larger and louder than what he actually felt. The undoing of 9 years of wrongful silence ought to move through you like weather, with weight, with the physical sensation of something that has been pressing in finally releasing. What he felt instead was quiet. Good quiet. The quiet of a room after something loud has been going on for a very long time and has finally stopped. Not emptiness, resolution. The kind of stillness that has something solid at its center. He went back to the training review. Serena came on a Saturday morning, 10 days before the Cross Center for Aerial Emergency Medicine was scheduled to open. She did not call ahead. She did not text. She appeared at the door of his apartment at 9:15 in the morning, wearing a gray coat with her hands folded in front of her, and the expression of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say, and then at the last moment decided not to use the rehearsal. Nadia was at a friend's house. The apartment was quiet. Everett opened the door and looked at her. A moment passed between them where neither of them said anything. "Come in," he said. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the access log images had arrived at 10:47 in the evening, where Nadia did her homework and had strong opinions about the injustice of memorizing state capitals when the internet existed, where Everett had eaten alone for months, learning the specific architecture of a life that had contracted all at once. Serena looked around the apartment with the careful expression of someone taking in information they have decided not to react to visibly. "I saw the news," she said, "about Preston." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I knew he wasn't entirely honest," she said finally. Her voice was measured, not defensive, the voice of someone who has been sitting with an accounting of themselves and has decided to read it aloud. Some of the things he told me about how to structure the settlement. I asked about some of it. Not enough. I didn't push because I wanted it to be over. She looked at her hands. I wanted to be done with all of it. The years after Harwick, the clinic, the way things had been between us. I told myself I was protecting myself. You were, Everett said. She looked up. That's not the same thing as being right, he said. He kept his voice level, not cold level. There was a version of this conversation that could turn sharp, and he was not interested in that version. You left. That's done. Preston made leaving very easy, and you let him because the alternative was harder and you were tired. I understand that. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand that. She absorbed this without flinching, which told him she had been sitting with this version of the truth for a while before she came. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, she said. I don't think I've earned that. No, he said. You haven't. The words landed plainly, not as weapons, as facts. The kind of facts that need to be said and need to be heard regardless of what they cost. I want to be part of Nadia's life, Serena said. Her actual life. Not visits on a schedule, not calls that feel like checking a box. I want to be her mother in the way I should have been. Everett leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment, not calculating, weighing. The way you weigh something when the decision matters and you want to make it correctly rather than quickly. He thought about Nadia, 11 years old, keeping a ledger somewhere, asking questions in careful voices and receiving answers with the measuring gaze of someone who would one day present everything she had been recording. He thought about what it would cost her to grow up with a mother who arrived on scheduled days and left again without leaving anything real behind. And he thought about what it would cost her to grow up without a mother who was genuinely trying. Those were not the same cost, and Nadia was the one who would pay whichever one it was. Start with the truth, he said. Not with me, with her. She is going to ask you questions. She already asked me questions I don't always know how to answer. And she deserves honest answers, not a version of events shaped to protect you. The actual truth in whatever pieces she can hold at a time. He paused. If you can do that, then we build something that works for her. That is the only thing I am interested in. What works for Nadia? Serena's eyes were wet. She did not look away. Okay, she said quietly. It was not a reconciliation. It was not forgiveness, fully given or received. It was not the end of something or the beginning of something you could name with confidence yet. It was smaller than all of those things and possibly more durable than most of them. A door left open by a fraction, enough for a child to walk through without having to choose between the two people who loved her most. Everett stood, walked to the kitchen counter, poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he had made at 7. He set one in front of Serena. They sat across from each other and talked about Nadia, her homework, the geography worksheets, and her deeply held opinions about the injustice of memorizing state capitals. The soccer team she had joined in September and her specific intensity about defensive positioning, which Everett said she had not inherited from him, and which Serena said with something that was almost a smile and might have been a real one she absolutely had. It was not easy, but it was honest. And honest was where things that were real had to start. The Meridian Cross Center for Aerial Emergency Medicine opened on a Tuesday in late October. The ceremony was held on the tarmac outside the main training hangar. October in Atlanta behaving like October for once, clear and slightly cool in the way that feels like a courtesy after months of heat. The facility had been expanded over the past weeks. A second simulation hangar added. New communications equipment installed. A dedicated training wing for the rural county paramedic teams who would work alongside Meridian on the expanded federal coverage that the rescheduled demonstration had secured 3 weeks earlier. Cleanly and without incident, with an 11-minute hemorrhage stabilization time that had drawn silence from the federal observers in the way that real results draw silence from people who have seen enough to know the difference between performance and substance. Vivian spoke for 7 minutes. She spoke about the 11 patients who had not survived their transports. She named them, not as statistics or data points or evidence in support of a larger argument. As people. She said the Cross Center existed because of them, and because of the obligation their deaths had created, the obligation to understand what had failed and to build something that would not fail them again. She said Everett's name once briefly near the end. He had asked her to keep it brief. She had. Rowan stood near the hangar entrance in his field jacket, watching the ceremony with the attention of a man who has looked clearly at something he got wrong and is at peace with the looking. The conversation they had shared over bad coffee the week before had not been an apology. Rowan Tate was not a man who did apologies in the conventional sense, but it had carried the weight of one, and Everett had received it accordingly. After Vivian finished speaking, after the attendees moved toward the hangar for the facility tour, and the conversations that happen at the end of official things, Everett walked to the edge of the tarmac. Nadia was already there. She had come with him that morning in the car, asking questions the entire 40-minute drive about the helicopters, about the new protocol, about whether the expanded training wing had better snack options than the old break room, which she had visited once and found inadequate. He had answered in the order the questions arrived, which meant the snack question came up around the 20-minute mark, and she had accepted the answer, which was that he genuinely did not know, with the provisional grace of someone who intends to investigate personally. She stood at the tarmac's edge now in the jacket that was still slightly too large for her, and that she continued to prefer for reasons she had not explained and he had not pressed. Her hands were in the pockets. Her head was tilted back, watching one of the Meridian helicopters rise from Pad 3 on a routine transport run. The sound of it built and then began to recede. She watched it climb until it was smaller against the October sky, and then she watched it a little longer after that. "Is that one running your protocol?" she asked. "All 31 are," he said. She considered this with the gravity she brought to most things that mattered. "How many people will it save?" "I don't know yet," he said. "We'll track the outcomes over time. Compare the numbers to what they were before." "That's not really an answer." "It's the honest one." He looked at her. "We'll know more in 6 months, in a year. The data will tell us." She turned to look at him with that sideways gaze, the measuring one. "But you think it will save people?" "Yes," he said, "more than before. That's what I can say right now." She seemed to find this acceptable, if not entirely satisfying, which was the right response, and told him not for the first time that she was going to be fine. Better than fine. She was going to be someone who demanded honest answers and recognized them when she got them, and knew the difference between honest and comfortable. That was everything. That was the whole thing. She leaned against his arm. Not a hug, not a gesture that required anything in return. Just the small, natural lean of a child who has decided the person next to her is a safe place to be. He put his hand on her shoulder and felt the particular lightness of it, the weight underneath that lightness. He thought about the version of himself who had stood on courthouse steps with his hand in an empty pocket, trying to remember how to breathe like a man who still had somewhere to be. He thought about the drive in Vivian's helicopter, Atlanta falling away below. He thought about a simulation bay and a stopwatch in 19 minutes becoming 11. He thought about Dottie Pierce driving to a bank on a Tuesday evening and photographing every page of a document she had kept safe for 9 years, because she could not bring herself to throw away something that might one day matter. He thought about Leonard Pruitt, the way he always thought about him, with the sorrow that does not resolve, and the clarity that does not erase the sorrow, but sits alongside it, making it possible to carry without being crushed. He had not saved Leonard Pruitt. He had tried, and the body had reached the point where trying was not enough. That was true and would always be true. What was also true was that someone had taken that real loss in a real operating room and turned it into a mechanism. And that truth had been waiting 9 years in a safety deposit box in the careful hands of a woman who hadn't known what else to do with it except keep it safe. The helicopter was getting smaller now, moving north over the tree line, carrying its crew and its equipment and its revised protocol toward whatever county needed it tonight. Nadia pulled one hand out of her pocket and pointed at the open sky. A second aircraft was visible, distant, moving on a different vector. Different flight, different crew, different patients somewhere out there in a rural county where the roads were long and the hospitals were far, and the distance between a person and what came next was measured in minutes. "Is that another one?" she asked. "Transport run," he said. Somebody needed help out in the county. She watched it, getting smaller, getting quieter. "And they're going to be okay." He looked at the sky above the tree line where the aircraft was becoming a shape and then a sound, and then almost nothing. They have a better chance than they would have had last month, he said. She thought about that, processed it in the way she processed things that mattered completely without rushing toward a conclusion just because a conclusion was available. That's the honest answer, she said. That's the honest answer, he agreed. She leaned against him again, and he kept his hand on her shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a while. The helicopter moved north and grew smaller and crossed the tree line and disappeared. And out there in the air above the counties where the roads were long and the hospitals were far, something had changed. Not everything. Not the accidents that happened on back roads and in fields. Not the grief that followed. Not the families who would still sit in waiting rooms and hear news that changed their lives. But the 12 minutes in the air, the sequence of hands reaching for equipment, the protocol in the kit, the difference between 19 minutes and 11 that had changed. That was real. That would be there tomorrow and the day after, and in the data they would track over the coming months, and in the outcomes that would be different from what they would have been. Everett Caldwell looked at the clear October sky above Atlanta and held his daughter's shoulder and understood in the quiet way that real things are understood rather than announced that this was what beginning again looked like. Not fanfare, not a ceremony though there had been one, not a statement from a hospital though that had come too, a helicopter in the air, a protocol in the kit, a child leaning against your arm with her hands in her pockets. And the work. The work that had always been real even when the record said otherwise. The work that had been waiting patient, preserved certain that the moment would come. The work that was just beginning.